Hey guys, tonight we are stepping into the flickering candlelit halls of European palaces, where velvet curtains hold in the draft, and the air smells faintly of beeswax, old stone, and the nerves of people who know their entire existence depends on who marries whom. You can almost hear the shuffle of slippers across polished floors, the rustle of embroidered skirts, the little sighs of courtiers who've been waiting all day just to be ignored by a duke with gout. You're not here as a guest of honor. Mind you, you're a quiet observer, tucked in a shadowy corner of history, watching how Europe's great royal daughters were born into dynasties that twisted and folded back on themselves like overcooked spaghetti. And spoiler alert, you probably wouldn't survive this story if you actually had to live it, because you'd either faint at the smells, get caught in the endless politics, or discover you were expected to marry your cousin, who is, inconveniently, already your cousin twice over. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're still awake enough, post your location and local time in the comments. I always love seeing where in the world everyone is tuning in from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge in your imagination through a chilly corridor of some castle in the late 15th century. The walls are damp because insulation hasn't been invented yet, and the portraits on the walls look suspiciously similar to each other. That's because the same nose, the same jaw, and the same set of slightly haunted eyes keep showing up, generation after generation. In Europe's royal families, especially the ones with the biggest ambitions, marriage was less about romance and more about geopolitics, land alliances, and bragging rights. Those were the real wedding gifts. The daughters born into these dynasties weren't exactly children in the way you think of childhood now. They were pawns, delicate chess pieces wrapped in satin and pearls, traded back and forth across borders. And the more these dynasties wanted to keep power within the family, the smaller their marriage pool became. You can see where this is going. When your family tree is more like a tangled wreath, the leaves begin to wither. The Habsburgs, of course, are the ones who perfected this system, and you'll meet them in detail soon enough. But they weren't the only culprits. Royal daughters from Spain to Austria to France often found themselves marrying uncles, cousins, and sometimes both at once in the same tangled lineage. It sounds absurd, but when the alternative was risking that your neighbor might snatch up your kingdom through a better marriage, well, absurdity became tradition. Imagine you're a teenage princess, told that you're engaged to a man you've technically already shared a nursery with, except now he has a crown and you're supposed to smile about it. You sit at an oak table while ladies-in-waiting whisper behind their fans, and you realize you'll be shipped off to another castle, another set of damp walls, and a family who already knows you a little asterisk too well. One widely accepted fact is that Europe's royal families genuinely believed they were divinely chosen. So keeping the bloodline pure seemed logical, even sacred. Purity in practice just meant recycling the same handful of surnames until everyone started looking alike. Historians still argue whether this was sheer stubbornness, lack of imagination, or just bad math, but the result is clear. Royal daughters carried the weight of genetics as well as crowns, and their lives tell us how fragile power can be when you forget to diversify your family tree. You drift through another hall, this one hung with tapestries depicting heroic battles, though if you look closely, everyone in the tapestry looks suspiciously like the same three brothers. The daughters, of course, don't appear much in the artwork unless they're shown holding a token of marriage. Their real lives were less about being immortalized in wool and more about becoming bargaining chips. You'd think, maybe, if you were a princess, you'd at least get a nice set of jewels out of it. And sure, sometimes you did. But those pearls and emeralds came with the fine print that you were expected to produce healthy heirs. Keep smiling through chronic illnesses, and occasionally smile while your cousin husband reminded you that, yes, he was technically your cousin. A lesser-known detail is that many of these daughters kept careful diaries where they admitted what the official portraits never showed. In neat handwriting, they complained of headaches, exhaustion, strange pains that doctors called melancholy of the womb, which, frankly, sounds like a rejected indie band name. And the isolation of being in a foreign court where the language was strange and the food was stranger. Imagine nibbling on some overcooked venison, trying to look regal, while your new relatives scrutinize your every gesture to decide if you're healthy enough to be useful. And in the back of your mind, you remember that the girl before you, the princess, who didn't survive childbirth, had her name erased from most of the official records. That's the fate you're trying not to meet. As you walk deeper into this narrative, you notice something else. Even though these were the most powerful families in Europe, their palaces were often cold, drafty, and filled with the constant sound of coughing. Royal daughters, paraded as delicate blossoms, often lived lives of constant fragility. It wasn't just the inbreeding, though that played its role. It was also the endless pressure, the strict diets, the lack of genuine rest, and the occasional misstep of medieval medicine. Did you know that one royal physician once prescribed ground-up emeralds mixed into wine to treat stomach complaints? You do now. Spoiler, it didn't help. And yet, despite all of this, the system kept going. The daughters were married, the alliances were forged, the crowns glittered in candlelight. You, sitting in that cold, shadowy corner, realize that nobody at the time thought this was unusual. To them, this was how you preserved a kingdom, how you made sure your enemies didn't gain an advantage. You can almost hear the faint clinking of goblets raised at another engagement feast, while the bride smiles thinly, trying to hide the fact that her body already aches at 17. Irony is that these daughters were both priceless and disposable. Priceless because a single marriage contract could unite two great empires. Disposable because if they fell ill, there was always another younger sister waiting in line like a backup candle on a drafty altar. This is where the story begins, the great tangle of Europe's royal family trees, where the daughters became symbols of power, pawns of politics, and carriers of the very fragility that would one day bring whole dynasties tumbling down. So you keep walking past the tapestries, past the portraits, listening to the faint echoes of silk slippers and whispered gossip. The night stretches ahead, and with it, the story of what inbreeding did to Europe's royal daughters, their faces, their bodies, their futures. The candles flicker, the air grows heavier, and you realize this isn't just boring history. It's the story of lives lived on the edge of survival, dressed up in velvet and pearls, but trembling underneath. You press forward, leaving behind those drafty corridors where the family portraits already looked suspiciously repetitive. And now, you find yourself stepping into the domain of the Habsburgs. If Europe's dynasties were like a deck of cards, the Habsburgs were the ones who kept reshuffling the same hand over and over, convinced that if they just stacked enough cousins together, the result would be an empire that never ended. What actually appeared was a chin. Not just any chin, the infamous Habsburg chin, so prominent that even court painters, who were usually quite good at flattery, struggled to hide it behind strategically placed lace collars and carefully shadowed jawlines. You wander into a chamber where the walls are lined with these portraits, and you notice the gradual transformation. One generation with a slight underbite, the next with a jaw that juts further, until by the 17th century, the chin itself becomes a character in the royal narrative. You can almost imagine the conversation at a court banquet, someone politely ignoring that the heir struggles to chew his roasted pheasant because his teeth don't align. Historians still argue whether this trademark feature came from centuries of deliberate inbreeding, or whether it was just one unlucky genetic roll of the dice, exaggerated by time. Either way, the royal daughters of the Habsburgs carried this legacy in their faces, their bodies, and their futures. Picture one of these daughters, perhaps in the Spanish court of the 1600s. She's dressed in a gown so wide it could knock over an entire candelabra if she turns too quickly. Her bodice stitched so tightly she can barely breathe. Behind the layers of silk, she's exhausted. She's been painted as the image of power, her skin pale and her eyes fixed with solemn dignity. But in real life, she's frail, often ill, and already aware that her body has inherited the quirks of a family tree that doesn't branch much. You glance at her lips, small and pressed tight, and then at her chin, unmistakably jutting, a reminder that the empire's marriage strategies are etched right into her bones. What's strange, and almost darkly comedic, is how much these features were normalized in court life. When everyone around you shares the same family nose or jawline, you don't notice it as peculiar, you notice it as a mark of belonging. These daughters might even have been reassured that their appearance confirmed their bloodline was pure. Imagine being told, yes, your jaw makes it difficult to eat apples, but isn't it lovely that it proves you're a true Habsburg? It's like getting praised for inheriting the family's Wi-Fi password, but never actually being able to connect to the internet. The daughters weren't just symbols of this peculiar genetic branding. They were also instruments in spreading it further. Each time a Habsburg princess was married off, she carried the chin, the jaw, the fragile health across borders. In Spain, in Austria, in the Low Countries, you can trace how this genetic calling card spread like an invisible watermark. And yet, every marriage was celebrated with fireworks, feasts, and elaborate processions. You, standing in the crowd, might cheer at the golden carriages and banners fluttering in the wind, not realizing you're watching the slow-motion transmission of a dynasty's downfall. A lesser-known detail is that some ambassadors, who were responsible for scouting potential royal brides, actually reported back with descriptions of these features. In letters still preserved in archives, you'll find observations like, "The princess is virtuous and modest, though her underbite is pronounced," or "She possesses noble bearing, though one might say her appearance is particular." That's diplomat speak for lovely girl, but her genetics are waving a red flag. Still, the deals went through, because to royal families, appearance was negotiable, but dynastic purity was non-negotiable. If you lean in a little closer to this story, you'll notice how the Habsburg daughters themselves tried to make sense of their situation. Some leaned heavily into piety, seeing their physical weaknesses as signs of divine testing. Others threw themselves into the few pleasures allowed at court, patronizing music, commissioning tapestries, collecting exotic pets like monkeys and parrots to brighten up their otherwise restricted lives. Can you imagine sitting in a chilly Spanish palace, wrapped in furs, listening to a pet monkey screech, while you quietly wonder if your headaches are from fasting, fainting, or just centuries of bad matchmaking? You might also wonder about medicine. After all, surely someone must have noticed that the royal daughters weren't thriving. But medicine in those days was more theater than science. One princess might be prescribed leeches to balance her humors, another told to drink mule's milk, another advised to avoid fresh fruit entirely because it was thought to stir up dangerous vapors. There's a certain grim comedy in the idea of being surrounded by all the wealth of Europe, only to find your personal doctor sprinkling crushed gemstones into your wine, as if that's going to solve your migraines. Of course, not every Habsburg daughter was doomed. Some were surprisingly resilient, living into their 40s or 50s, which was considered respectable at the time. A few even developed reputations for wit and charm, hosting salons or writing letters that revealed sharp minds behind their delicate exteriors. Historians still argue whether the Habsburg decline is exaggerated, a story told with the benefit of hindsight, or whether it was as catastrophic as it looks in genealogical charts. But what's certain is that the daughters lived at the intersection of myth and biology. They were raised to believe their bloodline was their greatest treasure, even as that bloodline quietly undermined their health. You walk past another row of portraits, and you notice something odd. In painting after painting, the artists have gone to extraordinary lengths to disguise, or soften the most distinctive features. Shadows fall in just the right places. Lips are painted slightly fuller, chins less pronounced. It's history's earliest use of Photoshop, except instead of a filter, you had a painter who was being paid handsomely to make the princess look as if she could belong in a fairy tale. The reality, of course, was much more complicated. And here's the joke hidden in plain sight. No matter how much they adjusted the portraits, the next time the princess stepped into a marriage negotiation, everyone could see her in the flesh. You can almost imagine the awkward silence when the bride arrives, looking nothing like her flattering portrait, and the groom politely clears his throat. But the dynasty rolled on, generation after generation, each daughter raised to believe her duty was sacred. You picture a candle-lit room, a young princess kneeling in prayer, whispering for strength. Outside her chamber, courtiers shuffle past, whispering to each other about her health. She doesn't know yet that history will remember her not for her prayers, or her kindness, or her collections of tapestries, but for the chin she couldn't escape. As you linger in this chamber of portraits, you realize the Habsburg chin isn't just a feature, it's a metaphor. It's what happens when power is hoarded, when families become so obsessed with preserving their crowns that they forget to preserve their children. It's the reminder, etched in bone, that even the greatest empires can't outwit biology. And yet, at the time, nobody saw it that way. They just saw the weddings, the treaties, the gold and velvet. They raised their goblets and toasted to the empire's future, not realizing that future was already written in the angle of a jawline. So you take one last look at the portraits, at the painted eyes that follow you as you walk away, and you prepare to follow these daughters further, deeper into the courts where silence, ceremony, and suffering went hand in hand. The chin may be famous, but it was only the beginning of what inbreeding would do to Europe's royal daughters. You slip away from the hall of portraits and step into another palace, one that feels heavier somehow. The air is thick with incense, as if someone thought the best way to hide the smell of sickness and mildew was to drown it in perfumed smoke. You're in Spain now, in the court of the Habsburg kings, and here, silence isn't just golden, it's enforced. Every gesture is ceremonial, every smile stiff, every step carefully measured. The royal daughters of this court live like porcelain dolls trapped in cabinets, admired for their beauty, pitied for their fragility, and most of all, sacrificed for politics. Imagine you are seated at one of their endless court rituals. A young princess glides into the room, her gown weighing more than the girl herself, her hair pinned with pearls. She bows in precise increments, just enough to honor her elders, but never enough to suggest humility unbecoming of a royal daughter. You can almost feel her ribs straining beneath the corset, her breath shallow, but no one dares comment. What they do notice, however, are the shadows under her eyes, the pallor of her skin, the way she seems exhausted before the evening has even begun. One of the most haunting things about the Spanish court was its obsession with ceremony over humanity. Everything had a protocol. How many steps a princess could take toward her father, how many words she could speak in public, even how many people could be in the room when she ate. The daughters weren't so much children as living symbols of dynastic ambition. And yet, behind that controlled exterior, their bodies were often failing them. Some limped quietly from hip deformities. Some suffered seizures. Some coughed endlessly from tuberculosis. Historians still argue whether these illnesses were exaggerated by gossip or genuinely widespread. But the fact remains. Silence covered everything. To admit fragility was to admit weakness, and weakness was unacceptable when you carried the survival of a dynasty in your womb. You think back to one daughter in particular, Margaret Theresa, the little infanta immortalized by Velázquez in the famous painting Las Meninas. You've probably seen it, the tiny blonde girl in a stiff dress, surrounded by attendants, staring out at the viewer with solemn eyes. On the canvas, she looks like a delicate doll, perfectly composed. In real life, Margaret was the product of one of the tightest loops in the Habsburg family tree. Her parents were uncle and niece, and their marriage was celebrated as a triumph of dynastic unity. For Margaret, however, it meant growing up frail, married off at 15 to her maternal uncle, and dead by 21. The painting shows her as eternal, untouched by time, but the truth is that she carried fragility in her very bones. Picture another Spanish princess, Mariana, who married into Austria. Her letters speak of constant illness, of headaches and weakness, of pregnancies that ended in tragedy. The court recorded her every movement with solemn reverence, but what they didn't write down was the misery of a girl whose body was never quite equal to her role. A lesser-known detail is that she once asked to return home to Spain because she felt so out of place in Austria's colder, sterner world. Instead, she was told her duty was greater than her discomfort. And so she stayed, coughing into lace handkerchiefs, fulfilling her ceremonial role, even as her health withered away. At this point, you might wonder why no one tried to change the system. Surely someone noticed that all these royal daughters were frail, that their marriages often ended in sickly heirs, or no heirs at all. But change was impossible, because change meant risk, and risk was the one thing dynasties couldn't allow. To marry outside the established web of cousins was to invite suspicion, to risk diluting the sacred bloodline. So the cycle continued. Imagine being a girl raised to believe that marrying your uncle was not only normal, but a duty. You sit in a cold chamber, surrounded by priests and courtiers, and you pray for strength, even as your stomach twists with dread. One widely accepted fact is that the Spanish Habsburg court was notorious for its rigid etiquette. Foreign visitors often wrote back home in disbelief at how stiff and joyless the atmosphere was. One ambassador complained that it felt like living inside a funeral procession that never ended. For the royal daughters, growing up in such an environment meant never laughing too loudly, never running in the gardens, never being seen as ordinary. Their world was defined by silence and shadows. Even celebrations, marriages, christenings were weighed down by protocol. You imagine a wedding feast where the bride looks down at her untouched plate, her hands folded neatly in her lap, while musicians play softly and courtiers murmur about her health. A detail that rarely makes the textbooks is how much gossip circulated behind those stiff walls. Servants whispered about the princess's ailments, about their awkward gaits, about fainting spells in church. Everyone noticed, but no one dared say it aloud in front of the king. And so the daughters bore their burdens quietly, their lives recorded in official histories as triumphant marriages, but remembered by those who knew them as stories of constant suffering. You might pause here and chuckle darkly, realizing that these dynasties treated their daughters like prized racehorses, bred carefully, groomed meticulously, paraded publicly, but ignored the fact that the stable was collapsing. And unlike horses, these girls couldn't bolt for freedom. They had to stay in the gilded paddock, dressed in jewels, waiting for the next ceremonial appearance. One of the sadder patterns you notice as you wander through these palaces is how often these daughters died young. Fevers swept through, childbirth took its toll, malnutrition weakened bodies that were already fragile. Yet each death was met not with reform, but with substitution. Another sister stepped forward, another cousin prepared to take her place. Life in the Spanish court was like a chess game where every pawn was interchangeable, and the king remained stubbornly unmoved. You lean against a cold stone pillar and think about how much these daughters must have longed for simple pleasures, a walk in the sun, a meal without watching eyes, a conversation free of protocol. Instead, they lived in constant performance. Even their illnesses were part of the show, cloaked in euphemisms like delicate constitution or weak humors. Behind those phrases lay real suffering, but the daughters weren't allowed to voice it. Silence was their inheritance, along with the jewels, the gowns, and the marriages that carried them across Europe like fragile packages. So as you leave the Spanish court, you can't shake the image of those silent girls in their heavy gowns, standing in grand halls that smelled of incense and sorrow. You remember Margaret Teresa's painted eyes, Maria Anna's weary letters, the whispers of servants behind closed doors. You realize that the Spanish court perfected the art of covering fragility with ceremony, of turning suffering into silence. And the daughters, obedient to the end, lived and died within that silence, their faces etched forever into portraits that told half the story, but never the truth. From the incense-soaked silence of Spain, you drift into France, and it feels like stepping into another world entirely. Gone are the dimly lit halls heavy with protocol, replaced by glittering chandeliers, fountains spraying in manicured gardens, and walls practically sweating with gold leaf. Versailles is not just a palace, it's a statement piece. Here, every corridor, every hall, every gilded cornice whispers one thing: power. But as you wander through the salons and mirrored galleries, you begin to notice something else hiding beneath the glitter. The daughters of France may look like powdered porcelain dolls in their pastel gowns, beneath the lace and jewels, their bodies tell a quieter story, a story of fragility, whispered infertility, and lives that shine brightly but burn out too soon. You watch as a procession of royal daughters steps delicately across polished marble floors. Their dresses are the color of sugared almonds rose, pale blue, cream. They smile just enough to charm, curtsy just enough to please. But you notice the way some lean heavily on attendants, or the way others cough softly into embroidered handkerchiefs, hoping the sound is lost under the swell of court music. Versailles was a theater of appearances, and daughters were expected to perform their roles flawlessly, even when their bodies were rebelling. Take, for instance, the daughters of Louis XIV, the Sun King himself. He had many children, both legitimate and not, and the daughters especially were shuffled through alliances like gilded cards. Some were robust and witty, thriving amid the court's endless ceremonies. Others, however, were plagued by frailty. There are records of princesses who suffered repeated miscarriages, their every loss whispered about in salons as if their wombs were public property. Historians still argue whether stress, poor diet, or centuries of tangled genetics were to blame. But the truth is that these young women were expected to produce healthy heirs while living in a palace that was itself a breeding ground for illness. Because Versailles was beautiful, yes, but also damp, drafty, and constantly overcrowded. Imagine sharing your space with hundreds of courtiers, each coughing, sneezing, or wafting perfume to cover questionable hygiene. Doctors at court weren't exactly helping matters. One princess might be prescribed bloodletting for fevers of the womb, another instructed to inhale burning herbs to strengthen her lungs. It's a miracle any of them made it past 25. And yet, despite this, the French daughters were painted and celebrated as emblems of health and beauty. Court painters flattered them, smoothing over sallow complexions, enlarging their eyes, and painting roses into their cheeks. In reality, those roses might have been from constant fevers, or from rouge applied so thickly it cracked under the candlelight. You can picture a princess sitting stiffly for her portrait, her back aching, her head pounding, while the painter assures her she looks radiant. When the painting is unveiled, the court gasps at her beauty. Meanwhile, she goes home to lie in bed, too weak to stand for long. A lesser-known detail is how these daughters were often described in marriage negotiations. Ambassadors wrote letters praising their elegance, but quietly noting their poor health. One report might describe a girl as charming with grace enough to please any court, followed by a discreet mention that she is often confined to her chambers. In other words, lovely but frail. Still, alliances mattered more than lungs, so the deals were signed. You might pause to imagine a royal wedding at Versailles. The chapel glitters with light, the organ thunders, and the bride glides forward in a gown embroidered with pearls. The crowd sighs at the spectacle, but behind her smile, she feels faint, her body trembling under the weight of the jewels and the expectation that she will soon become pregnant. You can almost hear her whispering a private prayer, that her body will not betray her, that she will survive childbirth, that she will not end up as another sad tale told in hushed tones over wine. Historians like to debate whether Versailles itself made people sick. Some argue the damp air and poor sanitation contributed to the fragility of its inhabitants, while others claim that the patterns of illness were more genetic than environmental. Either way, the daughters were the ones caught in the middle, expected to embody the glory of France while quietly managing frail health. They were dressed in silk, their hair powdered and piled high. But sometimes they could barely walk across the grand gallery without needing to sit down. There's a kind of tragic humor in the contrast. The palace itself blazed with light, yet its daughters flickered like candles in the draught. At night, as fireworks exploded over the gardens, you can imagine a princess coughing in her chamber, listening to the celebrations outside, wondering if she'd ever see her children grow up. Some did not. Small coffins were not uncommon at Versailles, tucked into the endless cycle of births and deaths that the court treated as public business. Yet not all was sorrow. Some daughters carved out little pockets of joy amid the performance. They adored music, invited playwrights to their chambers, and kept small gardens where they could escape the relentless court schedule. A few were known for their humor, even gently mocking the absurdities of Versailles life. One princess once quipped that her father's court was so obsessed with appearances that even the statues might be powdered if anyone thought they looked too plain. These tiny rebellions, jokes, hobbies, letters, are the details that bring them to life beyond the tragic statistics. You can almost feel the rhythm of Versailles around you. The endless balls, the dinners, the music drifting through gilded doors. The daughters glide in and out of the spectacle, sometimes luminous, sometimes barely holding on. Their fragility is hidden under layers of powder and silk, their struggles tucked away in private letters and physicians' notes. But if you listen closely, you can hear the truth beneath the music. The sound of footsteps dragging, of sighs muffled behind fans, of whispered conversations about whether the princess will live long enough to fulfill her duty. And as you drift through those mirrored halls, you realize the French daughters, like their Spanish cousins, were trapped in a system that prized appearances over survival. They glittered in candlelight. They smiled in portraits. But beneath the surface, they were just as fragile as any other young women asked to carry the weight of an empire on their delicate shoulders. Leaving behind the glitter of Versailles, you find yourself crossing the Channel, where the damp fog of England wraps itself around your imagination like a cold blanket. Here the palaces are less theatrical than Versailles, less incense-soaked than Madrid, but no less political. The British monarchy has always been a peculiar balance of ceremony and practicality, and the daughters born into this world were both cherished and treated as political assets. Their stories carry the same threads you've already followed: fragility, expectation, and the heavy weight of inbreeding. But in Britain, there's a touch of stoicism layered over the suffering. The court liked to project stability, even when its daughters were fainting at the dinner table. You wander into Hampton Court, its red brick halls echoing with the footsteps of courtiers. Imagine sitting at one of those long oak tables, candles sputtering in the draught, while a princess tries to keep her composure as dizziness washes over her. The meal is heavy roasted meats, sweet puddings, cups of ale, and yet she takes only a few bites, her face pale. You overhear a whisper from a lady-in-waiting. Her grace is unwell again. But in the official record, nothing will appear. The daughter will be described as radiant, accomplished, pious. What won't be recorded is that she spent half the evening with her head between her knees, praying she wouldn't collapse in front of the ambassadors. The pattern of consanguineous marriages in Britain was not as notorious as among the Habsburgs, but it was still significant enough to leave its mark. Royal families across Europe intermarried, and the British crown was never isolated from these networks. Cousins married cousins, nieces married uncles, and daughters carried those genetic legacies into their lives. One widely accepted fact is that hemophilia, the so-called royal disease, entered European thrones through Queen Victoria and spread through her daughters and granddaughters. Though that story comes later, it is part of the same narrative. Daughters used as threads to stitch together alliances, carrying both wealth and weakness in their blood. But even before Victoria, British princesses lived under the shadow of frailty. Some were prone to fainting spells, others to nervous disorders, which today we might recognize as epilepsy or anxiety. Doctors, still clinging to humoral theory, prescribed treatments like mustard plasters, purges, or endless bleeding. Imagine being a royal daughter, already weak, and then having your doctor happily announce that the cure for your faintness is losing another pint of blood. You can almost hear the sarcastic inner voice. Oh yes, because I definitely had too much of that. A lesser-known detail from the British courts is how much gossip swirled about these daughters' health. Letters from ambassadors and visiting nobles often note when a princess was delicate or languid. One foreign envoy in the 17th century remarked that a certain royal daughter was pleasing in countenance, but often indisposed, which was a polite way of saying she spent more time in bed than at state dinners. Still, those marriages went forward because alliances mattered more than wellness. To marry a daughter of Britain was to tie your house to one of the most strategically important thrones in Europe, regardless of whether she could stand through a coronation without swaying. There's also the issue of expectation. British princesses were expected to embody virtue and composure. If a French daughter glittered at a ball, an English daughter was supposed to glow with restraint. You can imagine a young princess sitting in a chilly church, reciting prayers while her hands tremble, determined not to show weakness. Later, she might walk in the gardens with her sisters, clutching an arm for support, gossiping in soft voices about which cousin she'd be sent to marry. Their laughter carries faintly, though it's tinged with nervousness. They know their lives are not really their own. Historians still argue whether the fragility of British princesses was due more to genetics, poor medical care, or the simple stress of being born into an unforgiving role. Probably it was all three. Consider Princess Charlotte, daughter of George IV, who was celebrated as a hope for the dynasty. She was lively, beloved by the public, yet her health was unpredictable. She died tragically young during childbirth, despite being attended by the best physicians of the day. The nation mourned, but behind the mourning was a pattern already familiar across Europe. Royal daughters expected to secure a dynasty with their bodies, often paying the ultimate price. The irony is that the British court prided itself on moderation. Compared to Versailles, life at Windsor or Hampton Court might seem less excessive, less gilded. But moderation didn't prevent fragility. A princess could still faint in the middle of a dinner. A bride could still be shipped abroad, her dowry carrying more weight than her physical strength. And a daughter could still be remembered not for her wit or her kindness, but for the hereditary illness she carried into her new family. It's worth pausing here to note the peculiar British approach to appearances. Where the Spanish cloaked suffering in silence, and the French painted over it with glamour, the British tended to understate it with polite euphemism. A daughter wasn't sickly, she was delicate. She wasn't barren, she was unfortunate. She didn't collapse, she was overcome. You can imagine a lady-in-waiting gently explaining to a roomful of courtiers that her highness is overcome tonight, while the poor girl lies pale and sweating behind the chamber doors. This polite understatement is both comforting and cruel. It smooths over the rough edges of suffering, but it also erases the raw truth of what these daughters endured. And yet, despite their fragility, some of Britain's royal daughters managed to carve out roles for themselves. They engaged in charity, promoted the arts, wrote letters full of wit and observation. Some became beloved by the people, remembered for their kindness more than their ailments. But even those stories carry a shadow. Every time a daughter smiled at the public, you wonder if her head was throbbing, if her legs were trembling, if she was secretly praying to make it through the day without faltering. As you wander out into the misty gardens, you notice how different the atmosphere feels from Spain or France. Here, the fragility is wrapped in restraint, hidden behind a stiff upper lip. But it's still there, just as present, just as painful. These daughters lived in castles where the fires never seemed to warm the rooms, where doctors offered bleeding instead of cures, and where their futures were decided not by love, but by treaties. And every time they sat at a table and fainted, or lost a child, or whispered about another miscarriage, their lives became another verse in the quiet, tragic song of Europe's royal daughters. From the misty gardens of England, you drift eastward, carried across the chilly waters of the North Sea, until the low, flat landscapes of the Netherlands stretch before you. The Dutch Republic, though less ostentatious in its monarchic traditions, eventually entangled itself in the same web of dynastic marriages. And its daughters, too, bore the legacy of frailty and political pressure. The air here feels different, cooler, brisker, tinged with the smell of damp earth and canal water. But the weight pressing down on the young women is familiar. The great houses of Orange and Nassau tied themselves into Europe's dynastic knots, ensuring that their daughters inherited not only wealth and status, but also the weakening genes of too much consanguinity. Picture yourself walking through the grand halls of Hetlu Palace, built for William III and Mary II. Its symmetrical gardens carefully trimmed, its fountains sparkling in the gray light. It all looks orderly, rational, almost mathematical. But behind the neat hedges, behind the formal drawing rooms, you find daughters who tremble with fevers, who clutch letters from distant suitors, who feel the expectation of being a pawn in the continental chessboard. The irony here is that the Dutch prided themselves on pragmatism, on restraint compared to the excesses of Versailles. Yet, even in this setting of sobriety, the same fragility crept into the lives of princesses, cloaked not in diamonds, but in whispers and silences. One widely accepted fact is that the House of Orange repeatedly married into the powerful Protestant dynasties of Northern Europe, Hanover, Brandenburg, Hesse, and eventually Britain itself. These marriages helped secure alliances against Catholic powers, but they also reinforced the same circles of intermarriage. When you read the genealogies, you find that these daughters were often the great nieces or first cousins of their own husbands. And while the Dutch were less flamboyant than the Habsburgs, the genetic toll was quietly real. Letters from the 17th and 18th centuries occasionally note the poor health of these young women. She is prone to weakness, or her constitution is feeble, phrases that cover a wide spectrum of suffering. Imagine a princess of Orange standing before her mirror in the pale morning light, her maid fastening her stiff bodice. The air smells faintly of beeswax and canal water. She is only 15, already betrothed to a distant cousin in Germany. Her fingers shake slightly as she smooths the lace at her throat, though whether it is nerves or illness is unclear. Outside her chamber, her brothers prepare for hunting, laughing boisterously. She, however, is not expected to run or climb or gallop. She is expected to survive long enough to be escorted across borders, to bear children, to smile when painted in her wedding portrait. The thought lingers in her mind. How many of her sisters, cousins, or aunts had died young in childbirth, or wasted away with consumption? She has heard those stories whispered after prayers, when the maids think she cannot hear. A lesser-known detail about the Dutch princesses is how much their lives were shaped by the constant political balancing act of their house. Unlike the kings of France or Spain, the princes of Orange held their authority not by divine right, but by a careful blend of tradition, military success, and negotiation with the Dutch provinces. That meant daughters were especially valuable as marriage pieces. They could secure ties to Protestant Germany or strengthen bonds with Britain. One princess might be sent off to a cold castle in Berlin, another to Hanover, another across the sea to London. Their lives became threads in a larger tapestry of Protestant survival, woven against the looming threat of Catholic Europe. But those threads frayed easily when they snapped under the strain of illness, stillbirth, or early death. Historians still argue whether the apparent delicacy of these daughters reflected real genetic weakness, or whether it was amplified by the constant surveillance of court life. After all, noblewomen were expected to live as symbols of refinement, which often meant inactivity, heavy clothing, and diets designed more for ritual than nutrition. Add to that the long journeys they were forced to undertake, days or weeks in jolting carriages, across muddy roads, through cold inns, and you begin to see how even a robust girl might emerge pale and trembling by the time she arrived at her new husband's palace. But it cannot be ignored that many of these daughters really were frail, prone to miscarriages and nervous illnesses in patterns that suggest more than coincidence. You wander into one of the palace libraries, the air smelling of leather and old paper. You imagine a princess spending her afternoons here, eyes skimming across the Psalms, pausing every so often to press her hand against her temple. The candle sputters, the ink blots her page. She writes a letter to her betrothed cousin, dutifully expressing hope for their union, though she barely knows him. Outside, the fountains spray, the gardeners trim the hedges, the court bustles with preparation for another marriage. And inside, she wonders whether she will survive long enough to hold her first child. Of course, not all daughters of the Netherlands faded quietly. Some became queens, regents, or influential figures. Mary of Modena, Mary II, and later Queen Wilhelmina stand out as women who bore heavy burdens and navigated the intersection of frailty and authority. Yet, even in their strength, fragility lingers in the background. Wilhelmina herself, remembered as the Dutch queen during the World Wars, came from a long line of marriages that linked her house to others, carrying both strength and hereditary risk. Her survival, her resilience, stand out precisely because so many of her foremothers were not so fortunate. You can almost hear the gossip of the court as you move down the corridors. A lady whispers that the princess looked pale again today. Another insists that she is merely delicate, like all fine ladies. Meanwhile, the physicians argue about treatments. Perhaps more rest, perhaps another bleeding, perhaps a stronger purge. Their remedies seem almost laughably cruel now, as if the best way to cure a candle burning low is to snuff it harder. Yet in their day, these treatments were earnest attempts at care, however misguided. Imagine now the journey of one daughter, carried in a carriage to Berlin to marry an elector's son. The winter air seeps through the wooden panels. Her maid tucks blankets around her, but she still coughs violently as the wheels rattle. At each stop, she is offered hot broth and prayers. By the time she arrives at the castle, her face is pale, her energy sapped. Yet the wedding proceeds, music plays, and the ambassador writes home that Her Highness bore the ceremony with admirable grace. What the record will not say is that she collapsed in her chamber afterward, her body racked by fever. Walking out again into the gardens, you notice how carefully every hedge is clipped, every path straight. The symmetry is soothing, but also suffocating. It mirrors the lives of these daughters, measured, restrained, orderly, with little space for spontaneity. They were expected to stand in place, to smile, to marry who they were told, and to bear the weight of Europe's dynastic politics in their fragile bodies. And just like the clipped hedges, whenever a branch grew out of line, whether a daughter fell ill, miscarried, or rebelled, it was cut back, neatly, quietly, so that the facade of order remained. In the end, the daughters of the Netherlands remind you of how far the ripple of inbreeding spread. Not just in Spain or France, but in the quieter courts, in the pragmatic halls, in the carefully trimmed gardens of the Dutch Republic. Their stories may not glitter with Versailles diamonds or echo with Spanish incense, but they are no less tragic, no less human. Each daughter carried her weakness across borders, each fainting spell or lost pregnancy becoming a silent footnote in the grand narrative of Europe. And while the fountains at Het lose still spray, and the hedges still grow, their whispers remain in the corridors, whispers of fragility, expectation, and the cost of being born royal. From the canals and clipped gardens of the Netherlands, you drift further east, carried through the rolling fields of northern Germany, until the heavy forests of Brandenburg rise around you. The cold here bites sharper, the rivers run dark and restless, and the castles stand like stern guardians against both nature and neighboring powers. This is the land of the Hohenzollerns, a dynasty less adorned with the glitter of Versailles or Madrid, but no less tangled in the threads of intermarriage that bound Europe's noble houses together. Their daughters were, in many ways, mirrors of their Spanish and French cousins, born to cement alliances, raised to obey, and often fragile under the weight of duty. Brandenburg and later Prussia fashioned themselves as practical, martial states, where kings and princes built armies rather than fountains, and measured their prestige in regiments instead of ballrooms. Yet, even in this environment of iron and discipline, the daughters carried within them the same frailty that plagued royal households across the continent. The marriage treaties, carefully drawn up by diplomats, did not consider the bloodlines weaknesses, only the strength of alliances. Thus the same names appear again and again: Hanover, Saxony, Orange, Habsburg, stitched into the genealogies like threads woven too tightly, until the fabric itself began to fray. Imagine a daughter of Brandenburg, perhaps 14 or 15, sitting in a high-windowed chamber that smells faintly of pine smoke and damp stone. Her hair is braided tightly, her dress heavy with embroidery, though she shivers beneath it. Outside, the courtyard echoes with the sound of boots on stone, soldiers drilling even in the snow. She listens absently, her hands folded over a psalter, as her governess reminds her of her duty. Soon she will be married into Saxony, or perhaps Hesse, and she must be strong enough to represent her house. The girl nods, but a cough interrupts her answer, a dry rattle in her chest that makes the governess glance away uneasily. Frailty here is not only a physical condition, but an unspoken threat to political plans. The chronicles of Brandenburg daughters reveal a quiet pattern of illness, early death, and nervous melancholy. Some are recorded only briefly in family genealogies: born, married, miscarried, died young. Others flicker more brightly, leaving behind letters or memoirs that show both intelligence and sorrow. What binds them together is the constant sense of being moved across the map like chess pieces, from Berlin to Dresden, from Kassel to Hanover. Their journeys were rarely their own choice, and each journey carried with it the dangers of illness and exhaustion. The physicians of Brandenburg, like their counterparts elsewhere, applied the same treatments: purges, bleedings, tonics of questionable strength. A weak princess might be sent to the mineral baths of Carlsbad or Baden, her frailty cloaked in the hope of cure. Yet more often than not, she returned paler than before. To the outside world, these retreats were described as acts of piety or health. But within the family, they were desperate attempts to keep the dynastic thread from snapping. Step now into the grand halls of the Berlin Stadtschloss, with its high ceilings and echoing galleries. The cold seems to seep through even the tapestries. At a banquet, the elector's daughters are displayed in gowns of stiff brocade, their faces powdered, their movements carefully rehearsed. To the ambassadors, they look like jewels of the dynasty, shining, obedient, ready for alliance. But behind the glitter, you see the tremor in one daughter's hand as she lifts her goblet, the way another sways slightly when she stands too long. These are the details that do not make it into the official reports, but are whispered among ladies-in-waiting. Her Highness is delicate, her health uncertain. Yet, for all their fragility, some Brandenburg daughters became important figures in Europe's dynastic web. Consider Sophie Charlotte of Hanover, who married Frederick I of Prussia and became its first queen. Though not without health troubles of her own, she embodied the delicate balance between intelligence, charm, and political necessity. Her letters reveal a sharp wit, but also frequent references to fevers and weakness. Others, like Louise Ulrica of Prussia, carried the Hohenzollern name north to Sweden, where again the familiar story of nervous illness, miscarriages, and pressure unfolded. The environment itself played a role in their lives. The Prussian climate, with its damp winters and harsh winds, weighed heavily on those raised in more temperate courts. Imagine a young bride from the Netherlands or Britain arriving in Berlin in January, her carriage wheels grinding through frozen mud, the air sharp enough to burn her lungs. She steps into her new palace, already chilled to the bone, her body unprepared for the drafts that whisper through the stone halls. Within weeks, she is coughing, her physicians prescribing heated wine or bitter herbs. Her ladies whisper prayers, but the letters that go back to her family already hint at her decline. Still, the dynastic machinery rolled on. Each daughter was expected to bear sons, no matter how frail. Pregnancy, for them, was not a gentle hope, but a looming threat. Many carried children only to lose them, either in the womb or in infancy, and each loss drained them further. Records from the Brandenburg archives mention princesses who bore 6, 7, even 10 pregnancies, yet saw only 1 or 2 children survive to adulthood. The toll on their bodies was immense, yet rarely acknowledged beyond a curt note in the chronicles. Her Highness is again indisposed. You pause in one of the long galleries of the palace, looking up at portraits that line the walls. In each, the daughters are painted with pale skin, high foreheads, tightly bound bodices. Their gazes are calm, but their hands delicate, slim, fragile, tell another story. Many of these women did not live past 30. Their portraits remain, but their voices fade, their struggles tucked beneath layers of oil and varnish. And yet, in their quiet way, they shaped Europe. A Brandenburg daughter married into Hanover and helped pave the way for the eventual union with Britain. Another tied Brandenburg to Saxony, smoothing the rough edges of Protestant alliances. Another brought Hohenzollern blood to Russia, where Catherine the Great would later emerge from similar tangled roots. The web stretched wider, each daughter a node, her health fragile, but her significance immense. The pattern is striking when you trace it across generations. Frailty begat frailty, as marriages circled within the same narrow pool. The daughters coughed, fainted, miscarried, and died, but their names were still inscribed in treaties, their marriages still celebrated with fireworks. The courts did not learn, they could not afford to. Politics demanded alliances, and alliances demanded daughters, no matter how fragile. Walking now into the gardens outside the palace, you notice they are less ornate than Versailles. More severe, straight lines, clipped hedges, gravel paths. They reflect the Prussian ideal of order and discipline. Yet, within this rigid frame, the same fragility blooms. A daughter walks slowly down the path, her maid steadying her arm. She is only 17, but already weary, her breath shallow, her cheeks flushed with fever. She pauses by the fountain, watching the water fall in strict symmetry, and whispers a prayer that she might live long enough to see her children grown. The prayer vanishes in the cold air, unheard by those who expect only obedience. It is here, in Brandenburg and Prussia, that you begin to see the pattern not as isolated tragedies, but as part of a larger European story. The daughters of Spain, of France, of the Netherlands, and now of Brandenburg, all bore the same burden of hereditary weakness and dynastic duty. Their lives were threads in the same tangled weave, their suffering mirrored across borders. The differences of language, culture, and politics mattered less than the shared fragility written in their blood. And so you leave the forests of Brandenburg behind, carrying with you the echo of coughing daughters, of portraits with pale faces, of letters marked with the words delicate and indisposed. Their stories, though often forgotten in the shadow of kings and generals, remain essential to understanding the true cost of Europe's dynastic games. For behind every treaty, behind every alliance, there was a daughter frail, pressured, and too often lost before her time. From the forests and disciplined courtyards of Brandenburg, the road winds south into the lands of Austria, where the Habsburg dynasty ruled from Vienna. If Brandenburg was stern and practical, Austria was grand and ceremonial, its daughters raised beneath ceilings painted with angels and gold leaf vines, their lives framed by processions, masses, and endless rituals of etiquette. Yet beneath this splendor, the same shadow lingered: frailty of body, melancholy of spirit, and the inescapable pressure of dynastic necessity. The Habsburg daughters were perhaps the most famous examples of Europe's hereditary fragility. Their faces, immortalized in portraits, bore the telltale signs of intermarriage: the long jaw, the pale complexion, the narrow, tired eyes. The Habsburg jaw, as later historians would call it, was more than a physical trait. It was a symbol of how closely the dynasty had folded in upon itself. Generations of marriages between cousins and uncles and nieces had created a lineage that was politically powerful but physically weakened. Step into the Hofburg Palace in Vienna, where marble corridors echo with the clatter of shoes and the rustle of silk gowns. Here, a young archduchess walks slowly toward the chapel, her steps measured, her body frail beneath layers of brocade. She is perhaps 13, already betrothed to a cousin in Spain or Bavaria, her future dictated long before she was old enough to understand it. Her governess guides her, whispering prayers in Latin, while behind them, courtiers watch with the cool eyes of calculation. This girl, fragile as glass, carries the weight of alliances that stretch across Europe. Her body is not her own. It is a vessel for treaties and borders. The Habsburg daughters were raised under strict Catholic discipline. Their mornings began with prayers and confessions, their afternoons with lessons in languages, embroidery, and music. They were taught obedience above all, for obedience was the foundation of both faith and dynasty. Yet obedience did not protect them from illness. Many were described as delicate from childhood, plagued by weak lungs, crooked spines, or fevers that returned with every winter. Doctors dosed them with infusions of herbs, powders of crushed pearls, or even small amounts of mercury, hoping to strengthen their constitutions. Instead, the treatments often weakened them further. Marriage was always the goal, and the marriage market for Habsburg daughters stretched across the continent. Spain, Bavaria, Tuscany, Lorraine, even France each demanded a bride at some point. The journey to a new court was often a trial in itself. Imagine an Austrian archduchess, pale and coughing, being lifted into a carriage that would carry her hundreds of miles through cold mountains and damp valleys. Each jolt of the wheels strained her fragile body. She arrived in her new land exhausted, her health already precarious, yet expected to smile through banquets and ceremonies, to consummate her marriage swiftly, and to begin producing heirs. One of the most poignant examples was Maria Antonia, better known to the world as Marie Antoinette. Though she grew into the glittering, doomed queen of France, her childhood letters reveal a nervous, often sickly girl, prone to headaches and fainting. She was trained to be cheerful, to distract from her weaknesses, but beneath the charm lay the same pattern of frailty that marked so many Habsburg daughters. Her older sisters, too, bore similar burdens. Some married into Italian states, only to die young, their bodies broken by repeated pregnancies and miscarriages. The Habsburgs did not only export their daughters, they also imported brides from other courts. These women brought with them their own fragile health, their own histories of loss and illness. The Viennese court became a gathering place of pale young women, all dressed in jewels and velvet, yet coughing discreetly into lace handkerchiefs, their letters full of mentions of fevers and indisposition. For every grand ball, there were weeks of convalescence behind drawn curtains. Every child born balanced against the risk of losing the mother. Court chroniclers often noted these illnesses in passing, but rarely dwelt on them. The public face of the dynasty had to remain strong, unblemished. Yet in private, letters between sisters and mothers tell a different story, one of constant worry, of bodies that refused to obey, of prayers for survival whispered over and over. An archduchess might write to her mother that she hoped her next pregnancy would not end in tragedy, or that her cough was worse at night, or that she had fainted during Mass. These confessions, hidden away in family correspondence, reveal the human cost of a dynasty obsessed with continuity. In Vienna, illness was managed with ritual as much as medicine. When a daughter fell ill, chapels filled with the chanting of monks, candles burned day and night, and relics of saints were brought to her bedside. Physicians might bleed her or prescribe a diet of broth and wine, but the family placed as much faith in divine intervention as in earthly remedies. Sometimes the prayers seemed answered and the daughter recovered. More often, she lingered for weeks before slipping quietly away, her body too weak to endure. Consider the story of Archduchess Maria Josepha, who was betrothed to Ferdinand of Naples. She was young, intelligent, and pious, but as her wedding approached, she fell ill with smallpox. The court tried to conceal the severity, but within days she was dead, her body covered in sores. The alliance collapsed, and her sister Maria Carolina was sent in her place, a substitution as cold as it was practical. For the family, one daughter's death was a tragedy, but the political need was greater than grief. Another daughter would take her role, the dynastic machine grinding forward. Walk now through the Schönbrunn Palace gardens, where trimmed hedges and long avenues stretch toward the horizon. Here, daughters once walked slowly under parasols, their maids trailing behind, their conversations filled with sighs and half-finished thoughts. Some dreamed of escaping their fate, perhaps into a convent, where at least their frailty might be accepted. Yet most were denied that choice, their lives tied inexorably to the politics of Europe. A convent was a waste of a valuable asset, unless the daughter was so ill that no marriage could be arranged. Only then, when her frailty was undeniable, was she allowed to withdraw from the world and spend her days in prayer. And even there, frailty haunted them. Convent records from Vienna describe nuns of noble birth who spent their lives in and out of infirmaries, their duties limited by constant illness. They embroidered altar cloths, read psalms, and waited for their health to fail entirely. Some found peace in this, writing letters full of quiet acceptance. Others resented it, longing for the courtly life they had glimpsed but never lived fully. The Habsburg daughters were also burdened with the psychological weight of their upbringing. Raised in an atmosphere of rigid control, surrounded by priests and etiquette masters, many grew into women prone to nervous disorders, what their contemporaries called hysteria, melancholy, or weakness of the nerves. They wept easily, fainted often, or retreated into silence. Some became deeply religious, clinging to rituals as a form of control. Others turned to music, painting, or writing. Their creative pursuits both a refuge and an outlet for emotions they could not express openly. The dynasty's obsession with appearance meant that these frailties were hidden whenever possible. At balls, daughters were painted with rouge to disguise their pallor, corseted tightly to hide their weakness. They danced until they nearly collapsed, smiled until their lips trembled. To falter was to fail the dynasty, and so they pushed themselves, often at great cost. Behind the glittering facade of Vienna, behind the operas and the masquerades, lay a court full of sick rooms, whispered diagnoses, and early funerals. Yet, like their counterparts in Spain, France, and Brandenburg, the Habsburg daughters carried immense significance despite their frailty. They linked empires together, carried bloodlines across borders, and shaped the fates of nations. Their bodies may have been weak, but their marriages altered the course of wars, treaties, and dynastic successions. Without them, the map of Europe would have been very different. Picture one last scene in Vienna. A dying archduchess lies in a high-ceilinged chamber, her bed surrounded by priests chanting prayers, her family gathered in solemn silence. She is 25, her body worn down by childbirth and illness. Outside, the city prepares for another festival, carriages rattling over cobblestones, fireworks ready to burst in celebration of the empire's strength. But here, in this quiet room, lies the truth behind the facade, the fragility of the dynasty, embodied in the frailty of its daughters. Her death will be noted in a single line in the chronicles, yet it will ripple outward, reshaping alliances, rearranging marriages, redirecting history. And so you leave Austria, the echo of prayers and coughs lingering in your ears. The Habsburg daughters, like those before them, were both symbols of power and victims of its demands. Their frailty was not weakness, but the inevitable result of centuries of dynastic ambition. In their pale faces and trembling hands, you see the true cost of empire paid not on battlefields, but in the quiet suffering of daughters who carried the weight of nations in bodies too fragile to bear it. From the gilded chambers of Vienna, the journey turns westward, toward France, where the daughters of the Bourbon dynasty lived under chandeliers of crystal and ceilings, painted with endless allegories of divine right. If Austria was a world of ritual discipline and Catholic severity, France was a theater of spectacle, where even the smallest gesture was wrapped in performance. Yet, for all the glitter of Versailles, the same threads of fragility wove through the lives of its princesses. behind powdered wigs and silk gowns, frailty remained, shaping destinies in ways that palaces and pageantry could never conceal. At Versailles, the daughters of France, les filles de France, as they were known, were raised in a world where every move was observed. Their mournings began not in private, but in ritual. The king's daughters and granddaughters were dressed in full view of attendants, their hair arranged, their gowns chosen, their jewelry displayed, all according to rules as intricate as scripture. Even childhood was public, with nurses and governesses watched by ladies-in-waiting, and reports sent to the king of every cough, every fever, every fainting spell. The royal daughters were not merely children, they were symbols of France's power, their health a matter of state concern. But those reports were often troubling. The Bourbon princesses, like their Austrian cousins, were described as delicate. Smallpox swept through the court more than once, taking young lives before they could fulfill their dynastic roles. Tuberculosis haunted the palaces, thinning faces, hollowing eyes, and silencing laughter in echoing halls. Physicians prescribed bleeding, purgatives, and endless draughts of wine or milk, each remedy leaving the princesses weaker than before. The diet of Versailles itself contributed to their frailty. Banquets dazzled with their excess, yet the constant rich sauces, sweet pastries, and heavy meats were harsh on young stomachs. Princesses suffered from digestive troubles, migraines, and recurring fevers, worsened by a lifestyle of late nights and overheated rooms. Doctors warned against drafts, so windows were kept shut, the air inside thick and suffocating. Fragile bodies struggled to thrive in such conditions, and letters from the princesses are filled with laments about their health, their fatigue, their endless bouts of indisposition. Marriage, as always, was the destiny of most. The Bourbon daughters were pawns on the great chessboard of Europe, their hands sought by Spanish princes, Italian dukes, and German electors. Yet marriage often came late, for French kings were famously reluctant to part with their daughters. Louis XVI, for example, kept many of his daughters at court well into adulthood, partly out of affection, and partly because he saw little political advantage in sending them abroad. These unmarried princesses, known as mesdames, lived at Versailles like caged birds, glittering yet trapped, their health declining in the stifling atmosphere of the court. Their letters reveal an aching boredom, punctuated by bouts of illness. Mesdames Adélaïde, Victoire, and Sophie, daughters of Louis XVI, wrote often of their fatigue, their headaches, their weak constitutions. Some found solace in religion, others in music or reading, but all were marked by a sense of decline, as though the air itself drained them of vitality. Courtiers gossiped about their pallor, their nervous tempers, their tendency to withdraw from festivities. The court dismissed it as eccentricity, but it was in fact the quiet symptom of lives spent in constant constraint. When marriages did occur, they rarely improved matters. Consider the fate of Louise Elizabeth, daughter of Louis XVI, married off to the Duke of Parma at the age of 12. Her frail body was ill-suited to the rigors of early motherhood, yet she was expected to produce heirs at once. Letters describe her exhaustion, her lingering illnesses, and her struggle to adapt to a new court that viewed her as foreign and distant. She bore children, but her health never recovered, and she died at 32, another victim of dynastic ambition. Even queens of France, women who seemed the pinnacle of majesty, carried their frailty like hidden shadows. Queen Marie Lesksinska, wife of Louis XV, was known for her piety and quiet demeanor, but she was plagued by ill health throughout her life. Her pregnancies weakened her body, leaving her prone to fevers and exhaustion. She often withdrew from court life, retreating to her chambers, while her husband pursued mistresses. In portraits, she appears serene, but letters describe her constant struggle with weakness and melancholy, a reminder that queenship offered no immunity from the burdens of frailty. Later, the most famous daughter of Austria, Marie Antoinette, would join the French court. Her youth, beauty, and energy seemed at first to defy the pattern, yet even she was not free of it. Her repeated pregnancies, her miscarriages, her periods of nervous collapse, all fit within the long history of fragile queens and princesses at Versailles. The court mocked her for her supposed frivolity, yet her letters reveal a woman often anxious about her health, worried about her children's survival, and aware of her body's limitations. The fragility of the Bourbon daughters was not only physical, but psychological. The court of Versailles was a place of relentless scrutiny, where every gesture could be twisted into gossip, every cough into scandal. Princesses grew up under immense pressure to embody perfection, and many succumbed to nervous disorders. They fainted in salons, burst into tears at the opera, or withdrew into near silence. Physicians diagnosed them with vapors or melancholy, prescribing baths, music, or gentle exercise. But nothing could cure the deeper wound, a life lived without true freedom, where even illness was politicized. To walk through Versailles in those years is to pass from glittering hall to shadowed chamber. In the Hall of Mirrors, music and laughter echo beneath chandeliers, yet only a few doors away, a princess lies pale in bed, surrounded by physicians debating whether to bleed her again. In the chapel, priests chant prayers for recovery, while in the gardens, courtiers stroll and gossip, their words already anticipating who might replace her should she die. The French royal daughters, like those of Spain, Austria, and Brandenburg, were symbols of both magnificence and fragility. Their illnesses were whispered about in salons, painted over in portraits, excused as temporary weakness. But in truth, they were part of the fabric of dynastic life. Every cough, every miscarriage, every fainting spell was another reminder that the power of kings and queens rested on the uncertain bodies of their daughters. When revolution finally came to France, the plight of the royal daughters became sharper still. Mesdames Adélaïde and Victoire, elderly by then, fled Paris, their frail bodies carried in slow carriages across war-torn France. Letters describe their exhaustion, their sickness along the road, their their longing for peace. They had been raised in opulence, but in their final years, they lived as exiles, suffering the same weaknesses that had plagued them in gilded halls, only now without the comfort of court physicians and chaplains. The revolution revealed another truth long hidden, that the fragility of royal daughters was not merely personal, but political. The weakness of their bodies mirrored the weakness of dynasties that relied too heavily on appearances, too little on resilience. France's Bourbon princesses were not exceptions, but part of a larger pattern that stretched across Europe. And so, from the gilded mirrors of Versailles to the convent walls of Spain, from the strict courtyards of Brandenburg to the endless chapels of Austria, the story repeats. Royal daughters, fragile and burdened, lived lives at once exalted and constrained. Their illnesses, their melancholy, their early deaths were not accidents, but the natural outcome of a system that demanded everything from them while giving them so little in return. Step out of Versailles now, past the fountains and statues, the marble halls and painted ceilings. Behind you lies a palace that still dazzles with its grandeur, but within its history lingers the quiet echo of coughs, sighs, and whispered prayers. The Bourbon daughters, like their sisters across Europe, lived lives shaped by forces greater than themselves, yet defined by the small, intimate struggles of frail bodies and weary hearts. In them, the story of Europe's great dynasties is written not only in battles and treaties, but in fevers and fainting, in miscarriages and mourning, in the silent endurance of daughters too fragile for the burdens placed upon them. Northward now, the scene shifts to the courts of Scandinavia, where the winters were long and the dynasties fewer, but the same pattern endured. Denmark, Sweden, and Norway produced queens and princesses whose lives were caught in the same delicate balance between glory and fragility, their health often as precarious as their thrones. Unlike the gilded expanses of Versailles or the vast ceremonial corridors of Vienna, the Scandinavian courts were smaller, their rituals less overwhelming. Yet the burdens on royal daughters were no less heavy. In Copenhagen, the daughters of the Oldenburg dynasty were raised in a palace that was stately but far colder and less ornate than the French or Austrian courts. The damp winds of the Baltic swept into drafty chambers, and despite the furs and braziers, chill air settled into bones. The princesses coughed, their chests tightened, their fevers lingered, and physicians struggled to know whether it was simply the damp or something deeper, something congenital that haunted them. Princess Sophie Magdalene of Denmark, destined to become Queen of Sweden, was one of many described as delicate from youth. She suffered frequent headaches, nervous collapses, and fainting spells, yet she was expected to maintain the dignity of her station. Her marriage to Gustav III of Sweden was fraught from the beginning, not only because of politics, but also because her health left her unable to fulfill her most important dynastic role, bearing children. Whispers spread through Stockholm that she was barren, and her frailty became both personal sorrow and public scandal. Though she survived into later years, her life was marked by the constant shadow of failure imposed by her body's limitations. Scandinavian queens often lived in physical and emotional isolation, their frailty worsened by the long winters and the loneliness of foreign courts. Princesses married into Sweden or Denmark from German houses, leaving behind warmer lands for icy fortresses by the sea. Maria Eleonora of Brandenburg, who became Queen of Sweden in the early 17th century, struggled not only with ill health, but with depression so deep it was described as near madness. Her husband, Gustavus Adolphus, adored her at first, but soon grew weary of her incessant weeping, her sleepless nights, her weakness of body and spirit. After his death, she retreated into a melancholy existence, her frailty mirrored by her inability to care for her daughter, the future Queen Christina. Christina herself, though remembered for her intellect and eccentricity, was marked by the same thread of fragility. Small in stature, prone to illness, and uninterested in the expected roles of wife and mother, she abdicated her throne rather than continue in a life she could not bear. Historians often describe her as an anomaly, but in truth, her story fits well within the larger tapestry of fragile royal daughters. Bodies that could not withstand the weight of dynastic expectation, spirits that sought escape in religion, philosophy, or withdrawal. In Denmark, the frailty of queens was a recurring theme. Juliana Maria of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel, who married Frederick V, was often ill, described as nervous and melancholic. Yet her very fragility helped fuel her reputation as devout and gentle, qualities prized in a consort. Her stepdaughters, however, suffered less forgiving fates. Princesses confined to the court found themselves prone to what doctors called hysteria, a diagnosis that covered everything from seizures to fainting to uncontrollable weeping. Treatment was rest, prayer, and endless draughts of herbal tonics, none of which addressed the deeper reality of constrained lives. The climate itself shaped these histories. The endless Scandinavian winters pressed down on the body and mind alike. Sunshine was rare, exercise limited, and royal daughters were kept indoors to avoid chill and damp. The result was weak bones, pale skin, and what we might now recognize as symptoms of vitamin deficiency. At the time, however, physicians ascribed it to weakness of temperament, to nerves, or to divine chastisement. Princesses grew thinner each season, and families mourned daughters lost to consumption before they reached marriageable age. Yet despite the isolation, the Scandinavian courts were not immune to the broader web of dynastic politics. Princesses were sent south to marry into German, Russian, or British houses, their frailty often ill-suited to such journeys. Consider Princess Dagmar of Denmark, later Empress Maria Feodorovna of Russia. Though she grew stronger in adulthood, her early years were marked by fragile health. Her sisters too suffered bouts of sickness, a reminder that even in the relatively modest Danish court, the same hereditary delicacies reigned. Dagmar survived, but her daughter-in-law, Tsarina Alexandra of Russia, herself a granddaughter of Queen Victoria, became one of the most famous embodiments of royal fragility, carrying forward into the 20th century the same story that had begun in medieval palaces. Scandinavian pattern reveals something else. That frailty was sometimes transformed into sainthood. In Sweden, Catherine Jagiellon of Polish birth became queen consort in the 16th century. Her fragile health, combined with her piety and endurance during imprisonment, elevated her in memory to a figure of devotion. Likewise, in Denmark, tales of gentle, sickly princesses grew into stories of near saints, their weakness interpreted as spiritual refinement rather than bodily failure. It was one of the few ways fragility could be reframed as strength, though the cost to the women themselves was the same. Lives lived in suffering with little relief. Step into the cold corridors of Rosenborg or Drottningholm, and you can almost feel the chill that seeped into bones. The endless winter nights broken only by candlelight. Princesses walked those halls with shawls wrapped tightly, their coughs echoing in rooms lined with tapestries meant more for decoration than warmth. Their frailty was not accidental, but the natural result of climate, confinement, and a system that prized them not as individuals, but as vessels of dynastic continuity. And always, the letters speak of the same complaints: fatigue, headaches, weak stomachs, melancholy. Princess Hedwig of Denmark wrote of her constant nervous trembling. Princess Ulrika of Sweden described her migraines as punishments she could not escape. Queens complained of fainting fits during ceremonies, of bleeding that left them faint, of pregnancies that drained their strength. Some found solace in prayer, others in correspondence, but all bore the quiet burden of fragility, made heavier by the knowledge that their bodies were instruments of politics. It is tempting to imagine that in these northern courts, surrounded by forests and seas, royal daughters found a kind of freedom unknown at Versailles or Vienna. But their lives were no less constrained. The rituals were fewer, but the expectations the same. They were to marry, to bear children, to represent dynastic glory through their health and beauty. And when their bodies failed them, they were pitied, whispered about, sometimes even cast aside. Their frailty was never only their own. It belonged to the dynasty, to the court, to the nation. The story of fragile royal daughters in Scandinavia is less often told, overshadowed by the grandeur of Versailles or the tragedies of Vienna. Yet their lives, too, reveal the universality of the pattern. From Stockholm to Copenhagen, from Christiania to Turku, the same quiet echoes remain. The sound of coughs behind closed doors, the smell of medicines steeping in chambers, the sight of pale faces framed by pearls and lace. Behind every coronation and treaty stood daughters whose health was never secure, whose lives were marked by an unrelenting fragility that no crown could conceal. And so, in the north as in the south, the tale unfolds. Palaces glitter, but daughters suffer. Dynasties rise and fall, but fragility endures. Whether in gilded Versailles, damp Copenhagen, or icy Stockholm, the pattern remains the same. The bodies of royal daughters were battlegrounds where politics and nature collided, leaving behind stories of weakness, sorrow, and endurance that outlasted the splendor of their courts. Eastward now, across the flat plains and forests, the story carries into the great courts of Russia and Poland, where the scale of empire was vast, yet the same recurring thread of fragility persisted. The Russian palaces, with their onion domes gleaming and their endless marble halls, seemed to embody strength and permanence. But within their gilded chambers, royal daughters lived in bodies just as delicate as those of their cousins in France or Scandinavia. In fact, the Russian winters, harsher still, and the immense isolation of court life often made their sufferings even more profound. In Muscovy's earlier centuries, before Peter the Great wrenched his empire toward Europe, Tsarevnas were cloistered in the Tarim, a women's quarter secluded from the eyes of men. There, in dim rooms hung with carpets, they lived under a strange combination of opulence and confinement. They embroidered, prayed, and fasted, their movements strictly limited. The lack of fresh air and exercise weakened their bodies, and tales of constant illness pervade the chronicles. Many never married, considered too fragile or too cloistered for diplomatic matches. Their fragility became part of a mystique, a symbol of sanctity or sacrifice, but it was also a cage. As Russia opened to Europe, its princesses began to be woven into the marriage networks of the continent. Yet, even as they traveled westward, their health was often remarked upon. Anna Petrovna, daughter of Peter the Great, was described as lively, but constantly unwell, prone to fainting fits and fevers. Her sister, Elizabeth, fared somewhat stronger, yet she too suffered long illnesses, and her reign was marked by bouts of debility. Catherine the Great, though remembered as a robust ruler, in her youth was plagued with fevers and nervous conditions, though her iron will help to mask them. Her own daughters, particularly the grand duchesses who grew up in the freezing expanse of the Winter Palace, were thin and pale, vulnerable to the same cyclical fevers that haunted their cousins across Europe. The Russian court was a paradox. On the one hand, it reveled in theatrical grandeur, balls with thousands of candles, feasts where tables groaned with delicacies, gowns imported from Paris. On the other, the harsh winters seeped into every chamber, and the endless ceremonial duties drained the strength of those already delicate. Princesses fainted during receptions, coughed blood after carriage rides through the snow, or collapsed after long hours of standing in stiff, heavy brocade gowns. Physicians imported from Germany or France prescribed the same remedies, leeches, purges, and bitter draughts, that did little to cure. The Romanov daughters of the 19th century illustrate the continuity of this pattern most clearly. Nicholas I's daughters, for instance, were often ill. Grand Duchess Maria Nikolaevna suffered frequent fainting fits, described as weak nerves. Her sisters were pale, often bedridden with coughs or stomach complaints. Later, in the final generation of Romanov rule, four daughters of Nicholas II, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, grew up in relative seclusion, though remembered in photographs as smiling. Their letters speak often of headaches, colds, and fatigue. The most tragic of all, however, was their brother Alexei, heir to the throne, whose hemophilia exposed the hereditary fragility that had passed through their grandmother, Queen Victoria. The girls themselves did not inherit the disease, but they bore the weight of its shadow, tending their brother through endless bouts of bleeding, their own health worn thin by anxiety and sleeplessness. In Poland, though its political fate was less stable, the fragility of royal daughters was recorded with the same consistency. The Jagiellon princesses of the 16th century were often described as delicate. Princess Anna Jagiellon, who later became queen in her own right, suffered from poor health throughout her life. She was thin, frail, and plagued by melancholy. Her marriage came late, after years of being overlooked in favor of healthier sisters. Even when she ascended the throne, her reign was shadowed by her bodily weakness, which limited her ability to fulfill ceremonial duties. Her fragility, however, lent her a kind of moral authority, as if her suffering sanctified her rule. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, with its sprawling borders and turbulent politics, often looked to foreign marriages to strengthen its position. Yet the daughters it sent abroad were often unwell, and their frailty became a liability. Chroniclers note princesses who collapsed during weddings, queen's consort who died in childbirth within months of arriving in foreign lands, and young duchesses whose health failed under the strain of political upheaval. The constant travel, the poor roads, and the harsh winters compounded these problems, leaving behind a long trail of brief, sorrowful lives. Perhaps nowhere was the fragility of royal daughters more politicized than in Russia's alliance with Germany and Britain during the 19th century. Marriages bound Romanov daughters to the Hohenzollerns and the British royal house, and in each case, the question of health was paramount. Could the bride survive the journey? Could she bear children? Would her constitution endure the cold or the rigors of court life? The anxiety was constant, and often the reality fell short of the hope. Many brides sickened quickly, and their fragility became a diplomatic problem. What made the Russian story unique, however, was the overlay of mysticism. Fragility was not only seen as weakness, but also as a sign of divine favor or curse. The reliance on holy men, most famously embodied in Rasputin's influence over the last imperial family, was tied directly to the perception that royal bodies were both fragile and sacred. The Tsar's daughters prayed endlessly for their brother's health, their own delicate frames kneeling on cold chapel floors until exhaustion set in. Their frailty was bound up with the empire's fate, a visible reminder that the might of Russia rested on bodies that could not escape their vulnerabilities. The letters of Russian Grand Duchesses echo the same themes as those from Versailles or Vienna: endless fatigue, constant colds, weak lungs, headaches, and melancholy. Yet they add a uniquely Russian note of resignation, as though the vastness of the empire itself weighed upon them. "I am so tired," one wrote, "and yet I must stand and stand and stand." Their duty to be seen on balconies, at balls, in churches, was unrelenting, and their fragility, far from excusing them, often intensified the expectation to endure silently. The fate of Polish and Russian royal daughters thus mirrors that of their Western cousins, but with harsher winters, longer journeys, and a more overt entanglement with mysticism and fate. Their fragility was at once personal and political, private sorrow and public symbol. Behind the towering facades of the Kremlin or the palaces of Warsaw, the same quiet sufferings played out. Pale faces pressed to frosted windows, coughs muffled behind fans, letters filled with sighs and laments. And once more, the pattern repeats. Across empires and centuries, daughters born to rule were bound instead to frailty, their lives marked by illness, their bodies politicized, their weakness both pitied and exploited. Whether in the French salons, the Viennese gardens, the Scandinavian forests, or the Russian snows, the story is the same. Fragility, as much as power, shaped the destiny of royal daughters. Farther south, in the courts of Italy and the Iberian kingdoms, the tale unfolded with the same cadence of promise, overshadowed by frailty. Italian principalities, Florence, Mantua, Ferrara, and Naples, each produced daughters who were pawns in a network of alliances, and who, almost predictably, carried with them the shadow of illness. The climate, warmer than in the north, spared them some of the chills and coughs that plagued Scandinavian and Russian princesses. Yet the fevers of the south, the malarial air of marshes, the sweltering summers, the plague outbreaks that never fully receded, exacted their own toll. The Medici daughters, so often remembered as pawns of their ambitious fathers and brothers, embodied this contradiction. Isabella de' Medici, radiant and clever, suffered bouts of fever and weakness that curtailed her ability to appear at court functions. Though celebrated for her wit, she wrote often of exhaustion and headaches. Her cousin Catherine de' Medici, who would rise to power as Queen of France, was notoriously frail as a child. Her survival was uncertain, and her later strength in politics contrasted sharply with the weakness of her body. She endured repeated illnesses and miscarriages, each one a reminder of how fragile even the most powerful queen could be. The Est daughters of Ferrara faced similar fates. Renee of France, who married into the house, was delicate and often ill, her Protestant sympathies compounding the strain of her bodily fragility with political isolation. Isabella d'Este, though remembered as one of the great ladies of the Renaissance, was plagued by recurrent fevers and fatigue. Her letters, rich with art patronage and diplomacy, are punctuated with laments about her failing health. For every dazzling account of her salons, there is a quieter note of weakness, of being too tired to rise, of seeking remedies from quack physicians. In Naples and Sicily, the daughters of Aragon and Bourbon lived under skies brighter than their northern cousins. Yet their lives were no less shadowed by sickness. The Mediterranean diet and climate offered some advantage, but not enough to offset the hazards of court life, endless pregnancies, ceremonial duties, and the spread of contagion in crowded palaces. Queen Joanna of Naples, called the Mad by chroniclers, may well have suffered from a combination of melancholy and bodily weakness that contemporary physicians could not name. Her descendants, too, were marked by nervous disorders, frailty, and early deaths. When Italian princesses married northward into France, into Austria, into Spain, their frailty often became a subject of whispered gossip. Were they strong enough to bear heirs? Could their bodies endure colder climates? The same anxieties that surrounded every dynastic marriage pressed more heavily when a bride arrived pale and coughing, or when she fainted during her entry procession. Their health was both an intimate reality and a political liability, recorded in letters between ambassadors with the same precision as treaties. Spain, with its Habsburg inheritance, carried the burden of fragility in a way perhaps more visible than any other European dynasty. The famed Habsburg jaw, with its exaggerated features, was the outward sign of inbreeding, but the inward cost was frailer still. Weak constitutions, infertility, and early death. The daughters of Spain were not spared. Infanta Maria Theresa, who married Louis XIV of France, arrived in Paris with a dowry of wealth, but a body already weakened by years of illness. She bore the French king's 6 children, of whom only one survived infancy. Her health never recovered, and she died young, her life a story of constant childbirth and constant grief. Her sister, Infanta Margarita Teresa, immortalized by Velázquez in Las Meninas *, was betrothed while still a child to her uncle, the Emperor Leopold I. She traveled to Vienna at the age of 15, pale, slight, and already frail. Her new court marveled at her beauty, but soon despaired at her health. Pregnant 6 times in as many years, she wasted away, her body unable to bear the strain. She died at 21. Another Spanish princess, consumed by the very duties her birth demanded. The most tragic embodiment of Spanish fragility was perhaps Mariana of Neuburg, second wife of Charles II, the last Habsburg king of Spain. Charles himself, sickly from birth, incapable of fathering children, was the culmination of centuries of inbreeding. His sisters and nieces fared little better, their letters filled with accounts of weakness, fainting, and constant illness. Their bodies became symbols of a dynasty in decline. Frailty writ across a kingdom. Portugal, though often overshadowed by Spain, tells the same tale. The Braganza princesses, married into both Spanish and Austrian houses, were consistently described as delicate. Catherine of Braganza, who became Queen of England by marrying Charles II, brought with her not only a dowry of wealth and colonies, but also a reputation for ill health. She was plagued by miscarriages, her body unable to provide the heir England demanded, lampooned by English pamphleteers as a barren queen. She bore the double burden of illness and foreignness. behind the mockery lay a familiar truth. Her frailty was not unique, but shared by countless royal daughters, each one diminished by the strain of expectation. The Iberian courts, Catholic piety layered another dimension onto fragility. Weakness was often interpreted as sanctity, illness as a form of divine trial. Spanish princesses were praised for their patience in suffering, their frailty woven into hagiographic accounts of their virtue. Pale faces and thin bodies were described not only as signs of weakness, but also of holiness, the mark of souls destined for heaven. This sanctification of fragility offered consolation, but also reinforced silence. To complain of illness was to risk seeming ungrateful to God. To endure quietly was to embody virtue. Thus, royal daughters, even in their weakness, were expected to perform strength not through physical health, but through passive endurance. Yet fragility was not merely endured, it was also weaponized. In diplomatic negotiations, the illness of a princess could delay a marriage, excuse a broken betrothal, or shift alliances. Ambassadors reported on the menstrual cycles of queens, the coughs of archduchesses, the fainting spells of infantas, with the same gravity as political intrigues. A sickly bride might be seen as a liability, but her illness could also provide a convenient excuse for rejecting an unwanted match. In this way, the fragility of royal daughters was not only a personal tragedy, but also a tool of statecraft. Across Italy, Spain, and Portugal, the pattern echoes the north. Royal daughters lived under immense scrutiny, their bodies both revered and exploited, their fragility a constant theme. Whether in the Renaissance palaces of Florence or the shadowed halls of the Escorial, the story is the same. They were adorned with jewels and silks, painted by the greatest artists of their age, and praised for beauty and virtue. Yet behind the portraits lay lives shortened by childbirth, weakened by illness, and haunted by the unrelenting demands of dynasty. And as with France, Austria, Scandinavia, and Russia, their letters reveal the quiet truth: exhaustion, fevers, melancholy, and despair. They endured because they had no choice, because the survival of dynasties was written upon their bodies. Their fragility was both a burden and a legacy, carried across Europe, generation after generation, as surely as crowns and coats of arms. Farther east, in the realms of Poland, Hungary, and the shifting lands of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the lives of royal daughters unfolded within a world both more turbulent and more precarious than that of their Western cousins. These were lands beset by constant war, contested borders, and fragile unions of crowns, where marriage was less a ceremonial flourish and more a desperate necessity to secure survival. The fragility of princesses in these lands took on a new dimension. Not only did their bodies determine dynastic continuities, but their very survival was often the only bulwark against collapse. Polish princesses, daughters of the Jagiellonian line, were famously married off across Europe in the 15th and 16th centuries. They brought with them not only wealth and prestige, but also the unmistakable air of delicate constitutions. Bona Sforza, though not Polish-born, set the standard. Arriving from Italy to wed Sigismund I, she introduced Renaissance tastes to the court, but her health was marred by recurring fevers and stomach complaints. The daughters she bore inherited the frailty common to the mingling of Italian and Central European bloodlines. Isabella Jagiellon, sent to Hungary to marry John Zappalia, lived a life defined by exhaustion and sorrow. Widowed after a single year of marriage, she bore a son who would be king, but spent her remaining years plagued by sickness, caught between factions that used her weakness as leverage. Letters describe her suffering from chronic fevers, pains in her chest, and recurring bouts of weakness that left her unable to govern even her own household without assistance. Her sister Catherine, married into the Brandenburg line, similarly carried with her an aura of delicacy. Reports from the German courts described her as beautiful yet pale, prone to fainting, and often confined to her chambers. Softer still was Sophia Jagiellon, married into the ducal house of Brunswick-Luneburg, who died in her 30s, leaving behind children who themselves inherited patterns of weakness. These unions stretched the Jagiellonian influence across Europe, but at their heart was a line of daughters so often remembered for their fragility rather than their triumphs. In Hungary, where war with the Ottomans carved out every decision, princesses bore a double burden. They were symbols of resistance, embodiments of alliances, yet their health seldom withstood the pressures placed upon them. Anna of Bohemia and Hungary, married to Ferdinand I of Habsburg, became the vessel through which the Habsburgs claimed Hungary. She bore 15 children, her health steadily collapsing with each birth. Descriptions of her later years portray a woman so weakened that she could scarcely rise, her body hollowed by the relentless demands of fertility. She died at 41, her legacy carried on through children, but her own strength extinguished long before. Hungarian princesses allied with Poland or Austria often lived lives marked by confinement. Elizabeth of Hungary, married to Charles I of Anjou, is remembered less for her political importance than for her unending ill health. She was described as saintly, her frailty reframed as holiness, but contemporary accounts are clear. She was too weak to perform even ceremonial duties, and her survival into middle age was regarded as miraculous. Later Hungarian noblewomen elevated to royal status, such as Barbara Zappalia, consort of Sigismund I of Poland, fared little better. Barbara's beauty was much praised, but her life was cut short at just 24, worn down by fevers that struck after childbirth. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, stretching across vast territories, demanded much of its princesses. They were sent north into Sweden, west into Austria, south into Italy, and east into Muscovy, their marriages essential to holding together fragile alliances. Yet their constitutions seemed unable to endure such journeys. Constant travel, shifts in climate, and the weight of expectation turned already frail bodies into exhausted vessels. Princess Catherine Jagiellon, sent to Sweden as the wife of John III, endured imprisonment and illness throughout her life. Her letters home reveal constant pain, weakness, and grief, though she maintained a stoic front for political reasons. Her endurance, rather than her vitality, defined her legacy. Lithuanian-born daughters of noble houses who married upward into royal lines also found their lives marked by the same frailty. They are remembered in chronicles not as figures of strength, but as women whose health gave way under the pressures of foreign courts. Their pale skin and slender builds, often praised as beauty in their youth, became shorthand for weakness in later years. Fainting spells, miscarriages, fevers, and wasting illnesses haunt the records of their lives, reminders that even the vast Commonwealth could not breed resilience into its royal daughters. The fragility of Polish and Hungarian princesses had broader consequences than personal tragedy. In an era when dynasties depended upon female fertility, the premature deaths of these women destabilized entire kingdoms. The death of a queen consort in childbirth could plunge a realm into succession crises, force a king into hasty remarriage, or dissolve alliances painstakingly built. The endless string of miscarriages and infant deaths associated with fragile mothers meant that treaties were often written on sand, their terms undone by the failure of a single body to carry a child to adulthood. This reality was understood by contemporaries, who fretted constantly over the health of royal daughters. Ambassadors sent detailed reports to kings and dukes about the condition of princesses, whether their cheeks were flushed, whether they coughed in the evenings, whether they had the strength to dance. Even menstruation was scrutinized and reported, since irregular cycles meant uncertainty about fertility. The lives of royal daughters in Poland, Hungary, and Lithuania were measured in such intimate details, their health tracked with the precision of military campaigns. Yet despite all the scrutiny, no remedy could prevent the slow attrition of sickness. Physicians prescribed diets of boiled grains, infusions of herbs, and endless bloodletting. But these did little more than exacerbate weakness. Alchemists promised elixirs of strength. Priests offered relics, yet none could keep a princess from withering after her third or fourth childbirth, or from succumbing to a fever brought on by the damp stone walls of her residence. Many princesses died far from home, in lands where even the climate conspired against them. Italian-born queens shivering in Krakow, Polish-born archduchesses coughing in Vienna, Hungarian brides collapsing in Prague. Their portraits, painted with care, show them adorned with jewels and gowns, their features serene. But letters and chronicles betray the harsher truth. Beneath the pearls lay trembling bodies. Beneath the silks lay frail frames. Beneath the painted smiles lay women who could scarcely breathe without pain. Their fragility was not incidental, but defining, as much a part of their legacy as the crowns they wore. What is striking is how consistently the pattern repeats itself, regardless of geography. Whether in France, Spain, Italy, or the Polish lands, royal daughters were fragile. Their fragility was noted, recorded, and passed down in chronicles not as shame, but as inevitability. It became, in effect, part of what it meant to be royal, to live adorned but diminished, exalted but weak. They bore the weight of dynasties, yet rarely had the strength to carry it without breaking. And as Europe moved into the 17th century, these stories did not diminish. They multiplied. The fragility of royal daughters remained a constant, woven into the very fabric of dynastic history, as essential and inevitable as the treaties they sealed and the wars they provoked. From Krakow to Buda, from Vilnius to Vienna, their lives tell the same tale, delicate, exhausted, and short, yet marked with the solemn grandeur of crowns and titles that could not shield them from the simplest truth. Their bodies were too frail for the weight of empire,